Welcome everybody today to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation presentation of our panel discussion featuring Mr. Kevin Hampton, who is our Curator of History at the museum, as well as Mr. Christopher Kolakowski, who is our Director here at the museum. I want to welcome everybody. It's nice to see so many in attendance. Before we get started, I just want to say thanks to Jennifer Carlson and the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their support in putting on these free programs via the virtual platforms. We've been doing all sorts of programs, and then this is just one more offering that we're getting out there to the public to try to keep everybody involved in our historical aspects here at the museum. So thank you to the foundation. You guys do a fantastic job. And again, thanks to everybody who showed up today. One last note. Oh, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name's Eric Wright. I am the education specialist here at the museum. As we get started, if everybody could just keep in mind, use the chat feature, please, for any questions that you might have. We will get to all the questions toward the end of the program. So as the panel discussion moves forward and you have these questions coming up, just please enter them in the chat feature, and then we will get to your questions in turn toward the end of the program. So today we are here to talk about the anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And I will turn the platform over to our Curator of History, Kevin Hampton, and our Director here at the museum, Mr. Christopher Kolakowski. Gentlemen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Eric. Can everybody hear me?
Got you loud and clear, Eric, Kevin.
Well, thank you all for joining us. As we said, or as Eric said, this is our second Curator's Conversations, if you will. For those of you that joined us last time, you'll remember that I said that there's oftentimes, at least I would argue probably like 3 times a day, I stop into Chris's office and we just sit down and have a chat, a philosophical chat, if you will, about military history or a component or some study that we've recently been doing or research. And it's just more informal, it's more conversational, but it's kind of fun. And so it might be a little bit out of order from what you might be expecting. We're not going to recount the Battle of Gettysburg step by step. We're going to talk about some of those human interest pieces, if you will. But of course, as we all know with history, the only way to do that is to put it into context. And so we'll start right out of the chute with Gettysburg. And of course, we all know Gettysburg as, you know, the famous three-day battle of the Civil War. But we got to put that battle into perspective a little bit. So I'm gonna first ask Chris a couple questions here, and hopefully he can set the stage for us. First and foremost, this will not just be an Iron Brigade talk. For those of you that are familiar with my interests and research specialties, though despite I am fully prepared to do what needs to be done to make my point. But anyway, so let's set the stage for the conversation, Chris, shall we?
Sure.
Well, and actually we talked about this last week. Gettysburg isn't just July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. It's an entire campaign. It's bigger than that. And the human interest stories, the humanity behind the history, really actually there's a lot of focus on the before and the after. But let's set the tactical stage, if you will. So it's the second summer of the war. Actually, sorry, it's the third summer of the war. Mm-hmm. For the North, those summers haven't been too good in the Eastern Front. Let's be honest. They weren't going great in the Peninsula Campaign, and then of course the summer then the fall thereafter did see the first invasion, if you will, the first invasion of the North. So let's set the stage, Chris. What are we looking at here in June of 1863?
Well, you're right about Gettysburg, July 1, 2, 3, 1863. Most people look at that in isolation. Really, to understand, you have to understand the context, to your point. And the campaign really is basically from the first week or so of June 1863 right up until, depending on how you score it, either the 14th of July or shortly thereafter of 1863. Summer of 1863, actually, as you correctly point out, in the East, in the Virginia theater, has not been going very well for the United States. As a matter of fact, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, outside of Williamsburg and the storming of Marye's Heights in May of 1863, the Army of the Potomac, which is the main federal field force in the East has not won a clear-cut offensive victory against their main opponent, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. They did win what they consider to be an offensive victory at the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, as the Confederates would call it. But that was in Maryland in September of 1862. So this is an army that does not have a tremendous amount of good track record or success when they fight their Confederate opponents. Now, out west has been another story.
Right.
Out west, particularly in May of 1863, when U.S. Grant crosses the Mississippi River, begins to isolate and actually will lay siege to the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, one of the last two great strongholds on the Mississippi River, the other being Port Hudson, Louisiana, which is also under siege at that time. And then in Tennessee, you have William Stark Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland, which June 24th will move out into Middle Tennessee. And that'll be the campaign that sets up the Chickamauga campaign and the battles for Chattanooga in the fall of 1863. So it's in the East, it's not going very well for the North. They're holding the line at best. Out west, though, it's going much better. The problem is, in the popular mind, just like today in many ways, in the popular mind, what goes on in the East is more important than anything that goes on in the West. And so politically, the East, and then we can get into one of the reasons why Robert E. Lee is moving into Pennsylvania. Politically, what goes on in the East has far more cachet than what goes on in the West. Although what goes on in the West, you can argue, has more military cachet and more military importance than what goes on in the East.
Oh, very much so. And this string of, not say military defeats or I don't know, issues.
They're defeats. Let's call it what they are. They are defeats.
That's fair.
Some of them are humiliations, like the last battle the Army of the Potomac had fought, which is Chancellorsville.
Exactly.
Where they outnumber the Confederates 2-1 and lose.
Right.
And well, I'll tell you this too: when the Eastern armies all paint on their battle flags the battle honors, and when some of the regiments transfer from the East to the West, the Western units are like, "Why do you have all these battles on there?" Well, those are the ones we fought in. Okay, that's great, but if we were to do that with our flags, ours are victories.
Yep.
Why do you put your defeats on there? So no, they're totally. I mean, let's be honest with you on this. This is the Army of the Potomac has not done well.
No, and that sting is very recent. It's within weeks of this new campaign, and not only that, but it's not just a strategic defeat that they face in May of 1863 or a tactical one. It's quite actually humiliating, and in particular for one Wisconsin regiment that we're going to talk about here later on, who's going to make an effort to redeem themselves, and arguably for an entire corps of the Army of the Potomac, who's going to redeem themselves, and really they don't stand much of a chance. There's no way. But so on top of all these military defeats, the army itself is let's say not leaderless, but kind of confused of who's in charge to a degree, because there's been this veritable rotating door of commanders, and even to the point of only a few days before the big battle, right?
That's right. They've gone through a succession of commanders. First George McClellan, and then the John Pope interlude with the Army of Virginia, where some of the Army of the Potomac guys fought under him at Second Manassas, Second Bull Run, which I argue was the greatest victory Robert E. Lee wins in the war. Then you've had McClellan again for the Maryland campaign, then Ambrose Burnside for the Fredericksburg campaign, and then Joe Hooker for the Chancellorsville campaign in May of 1863. And then, on June 28th, he submits his resignation to the War Department, basically over a dispute over what to do with some of the detachments that are in Maryland and Baltimore and Harper's Ferry and other places, and whether they should join the Army of the Potomac. And he says, well, fine, if you're not going to let me maneuver the troops, I'm going to resign, not expecting that they are actually going to accept his resignation. And then they replace him with this man here, General George Meade, who has actually had a meteoric rise. He was commanding a brigade in September 1862, a division in December 1862 at Fredericksburg, where they're actually one of the only units of federal troops to reach and break the Confederate line at that battle. Right. Corps command at Chancellorsville, and then all of a sudden here he is. here he is in charge of the whole army. And he will remain in charge of the whole army for the rest of the war.
Yeah. And really, though, his reputation amongst the troops isn't any different, really, than any other corps commander. He hasn't necessarily earned renown, you know, amongst the First Corps, let's say, which is leading the advance into Pennsylvania. But in fact, you have a competing personality, I guess, is what I would say, that we're dealing with in terms of, especially the initial part of Gettysburg, which is going to be, of course, our dear friend, if I can get his photograph to come up, John Reynolds.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start with that introduction, like the comparison between the two, if you will.
Okay. And actually, I wouldn't say that they're competitors, because remember, they both come up in the same division, the Pennsylvania Reserve Division.
Yep.
Reynolds commands it at 2nd Manassas. He gives it over to Meade. You know, so they've known each other. They are rivals in the sense that you know, the ladder for promotion gets very narrow once you go above division to corps and then ultimately to army. So they are rivals. In fact, Reynolds had been offered command of the army, but he had too many stipulations and wanted a little too much independence than Lincoln and the War Department were willing to give him.
Yep.
But yeah, both of them are from Pennsylvania. Both of them have worked together before. In fact, Reynolds was Meade's boss at the Battle of Fredericksburg in the First Corps. You know, so they know each other.
Right.
They know each other. Whether they personally like each other, I'm not 100% sure about that, but I do know that there have been a couple times where they have clashed.
Well,
that famous line from Fredericksburg, what is it? My God, General Reynolds, how do you expect my entire division to whip the Confederate Army?
Yep. And now not only are they, you know, they've worked together in the past, but now they're actually working to defend their what many could call, you know, their home territory, their home state.
Right.
Based off of especially the troops that they've been leading. And that actually puts us into a great segue to why Gettysburg. Why is everything gathering around this? And we know Gettysburg as this great example of a meeting engagement. You know, it's not necessarily, you know, a static situation that everyone is aware where the army is and why it's there, and where everyone's gathering. So bring us up to speed on where everyone's moving here in those last few days of June.
The short answer, why Gettysburg, is the roads. I mean, if you look at a map of Gettysburg, even today, if you enter that part of Pennsylvania and you're trying to get anywhere in Pennsylvania, you have to go near or through Gettysburg to do it. Basically, what has happened is, and do we have a campaign map?
We do.
Is that what you're trying to find?
I'm trying to bring it up at the moment.
Okay. Basically, Lee's army has moved north through western Maryland and has entered Pennsylvania, while the Army of the Potomac is moving up through central Maryland trying to get, and is basically, when Meade takes command, is not far from crossing the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania.
Right.
Lee's army, on the other hand, has spread out far and wide into south central Pennsylvania. And some of his troops have actually reached the Susquehanna River not far from Harrisburg, the state capital. And here we go. You can see all the red lines. That's Lee's army. And you can see they reached the Susquehanna opposite Harrisburg on the 29th of June. As a matter of fact, today's the 157th anniversary of that, where Pennsylvania militia burned the bridges and prevent the Confederates from getting across into the state capital of Pennsylvania. Carlisle, so many of you are probably familiar out there in the audience. Carlisle is the home today of the Army War College. It was occupied by the Confederates for a little bit amount of time. And you can see that Lee, with his 75,000 or so men, is spread out all over in an arc from Chambersburg up all the way up to the Susquehanna River.
Yep.
And Jeb Stuart's cavalry is kind of riding around to the east of the Army of the Potomac as well.
You can see it here, yeah.
Yeah, and Lee realizes basically, I'm too exposed. Intelligence, particularly some spies. If you've seen the movie Gettysburg, there's a famous spy Harrison. Have already indicated that there's a new commander. The Army of the Potomac's on the move. I'm too spread out. I need to concentrate. And so let me concentrate in the area northwest of Gettysburg. And so he starts ordering all his troops to converge, as you can see there on the map. And meanwhile, Meade is moving north as well, and he decides that Gettysburg, regardless of how he operates against Lee, he needs to put some troops in and around Gettysburg to find out A, what's going on, and B, secure that area, because he's going to need to move through Gettysburg to get after Lee wherever Lee is going to be. And so that's how he sends John Beaufort's cavalry division on the 30th of June to Gettysburg, backing it up with John Reynolds with the 1st and the 11th Corps.
Right.
About 20,000 men all told, with orders to march in that direction. And so and then when those armies brushed together on the 30th of June and then again on the morning of the 1st of July, that's how the Battle of Gettysburg starts.
And let's look at, so you pointed out perfectly exactly what I wanted you to do. The 157 years ago today. But let's take it back one day forward, because you can see it here on this map perfectly. And just look how spread out the forces are. You've got June 28th, you've got Longstreet located up here near Chambersburg. You've got June 28th over here. Early is over here on the Susquehanna. You've got Stuart, who's actually way down here still, between the Army of the Potomac and Washington, D.C. He's moving through the Maryland countryside. And you also have then essentially the Army of the Potomac, which is just late to the game, really, to catch up to and screen Washington, D.C. from Lee's army. They're really centralized around Frederick, Maryland, and there's still 48 hours to go before the battle that we know today really takes place. But really, it's only about 24 hours, because by the night of the 30th, things are already happening here just across the state line that are going to dictate the rest of that week, really. Let's talk a little bit about weather too. It's not been terribly great. It's been raining. It's been raining for days, actually. In fact, one of the Wisconsin guys who's with the 7th Wisconsin talks about it's not terrible because they're on the turnpike, but it's still muddy. But I think one of the best quotes that I can remember is Dawes. He's writing home to Rufus Dawes of the 6th Wisconsin. He writes home to his wife on the 28th and says, "We have marched through some of the most beautiful country I ever saw. It's very refreshing to get out of the brown desert of Virginia into this land of thrift and beauty," which speaks also to this idea that for the first time, they're on northern soil, really, by the 30th of June. They're in Pennsylvania. And so there's a new tone that that the soldiers are working with. One of the greatest parts of this, for me, the story of Gettysburg really starts with one particular letter, and I'm going to bring it up here quick, and hopefully it's good enough resolution since I'm streaming it from my desktop in the office through my laptop here at the office or at home. Really hope this works. I apologize if it doesn't. But it's a letter by John Hunt. And John Hunt actually is a great story. I'm going to bring it up here. Let's see if I can share screen. There we go. Sure. And if I push expand, can you see it full screen now?
Yeah, it's tough to read. It's an eye test, though, Kevin.
It's an eye test anyway. But so I'll paraphrase it here for you. The thing I want you to see here is at the very top, if you can, camp near the state line in Pennsylvania, Adams County at the top there. Mm-hmm. And then the real part is between Emmitsburg, Maryland, and Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And then what's that date there? Can you read that, Chris?
July 1st, 1863.
Now, if you know anything about John Hunt, if you've looked at our collection, you'll know that John Hunt wrote a lot, and he didn't waste any part of his paper. So when you're looking at just this sheet of paper, there's obviously something missing. He didn't use every inch of every square inch of the piece of paper. He's actually left off a good chunk of it. And that's because not only the date, we'll leave it there, July 1st, 1863, which we know, of course, is the date of the beginning of the battle, but also what it says. So here, I've transcribed it in the notes section. Can you see that there?
Yep.
Perfect. Snatched a moment where I can write to you, spare to write you to say that I am good in good health and spirits. We've gotten some steady marching, essentially talking about the sheer volume of marching they've been doing to try and catch up to the Army of Northern Virginia, really. 25 miles in the first day. Now, by the 30th of June, they've actually only gone 3 miles. 3 to 4 miles. And they stop because the 30th of June is the end of a quarter, which for those that are familiar with Army structure means it's payday. It's payday.
Army bureaucracy must be served.
Exactly. So it's a light marching day. They only go about 3 miles. So they have pretty much the rest of the afternoon of the 30th, which many took to write letters home. John here obviously waited until the next morning, which was a risky move, but we benefit from it from the historical narrative here. But I want to point out just a couple of things here. We marched about 25 miles, which used me up. And then it says down here, we have traveled through Maryland and now lie in Pennsylvania just over the state line. So we've had some good chance to get milk, bread, and butter, which is just, it's a beautiful idea of what the mentality of they're going through. They're wet, they're soaking wet, they've been wet. Dawes, in that same letter to his wife the day before, has said that, can you imagine essentially marching in wet wool, wrapping yourself at night in a wet wool blanket, and then wearing wet wool the next morning, which really gives that idea of this really sucks. This isn't great. But there's the little things in life, chance to get milk and bread and butter. And I now feel fit to travel with any of them. And then he ends it here. Orders to march right off must stop. And that's how his letter ends. And I think that sets us up perfectly to talk about this momentous time that happens now, the morning of July 1st, 1863. So with that, set the stage for right north of Gettysburg, if you will.
So on the evening of the 30th, Harry Heath's division of A.P. Hill's Corps, the Army of Northern Virginia, had tried to get into Gettysburg, and depending on who you ask, it was a supply mission. Depending on whether it's the famous, or are you going to get shoes? Are you going to get other things? They brush against some Union cavalry under John Beaufort, as mentioned before, and then Heath says, well, you know, it's just some Pennsylvania militia and probably just some cavalry. And he goes to, and he says, can I go and do this again? And A.P. Hill that night says, yeah, go in, take your division and go get what needs to be, get what you need to do and secure the town. And so the next morning, shortly after dawn is when, and this is the map of later in the first day, the overview of the first day, coming in from the northwest along the Chambersburg Pike, which today is US 30, they encounter along McPherson's Ridge and along Hare Ridge, which you see right there. They encounter Buford's cavalry, and Beaufort very quickly forces them to deploy and sends a message down to the nearest troops he can find, which happened to be John Reynolds, the First Corps, including the Iron Brigade, including the letter writer you just wrote about.
Yep.
And can you get up here as fast as you can to support and to hold this area? With this area is going to be important, and we're going to try and hold.
Yeah.
And they move very quickly. And as a matter of fact, when the Iron Brigade with their distinctive headgear, which you modeled for us earlier, show up, it's a shock. When they see that hat, when the Confederates see that hat, there's a North Carolina soldier that says, there's those damn black hatters again. They ain't no militia. This is the Army of the Potomac. And that's when Harry Heath realizes we have bitten off far more than we expected to have to chew. And that's when the battle really gets going in earnest.
And I think that's exactly right. It's not like this was, like we said, planned or anything. This wasn't a concerted effort to establish the line. And then really Reynolds is just buying time. He's not anywhere positioned to have his entire wing of the army put into place yet. Beaufort knows this certainly. In fact, they're already outnumbered just from the sheer fact of what's in front of them is an entire, essentially, Confederate division versus some dismounted cavalry. So the firepower alone is already off balance. And it just so happens at the exact right time, those coincidences in history, that the First Corps comes up. Just as you can see here, Archer's brigade is pushing across Willoughby Run and about to really push off Beaufort's cavalry. Cutler, of course, his brigade has already just arrived just before that. There's a long contention between Cutler's brigade veterans and the Iron Brigade veterans of who was the first on the field, because up to that point, the Iron Brigade and their daily rotation of what brigade goes first, the brigade had been in the lead. And then, of course, because each day the next brigade in order of march rotates, Cutler's brigade took to the road first and made it to the field just in time. And you can see that they, Reynolds puts Cutler right up here to the north, because he's already got really nothing standing here to hold Davis's brigade as they come across.
Yeah, the Chambersburg Pike and the railroad really run kind of right down the middle of the battlefield, and that becomes you get what happens north. The battle develops primarily to the south, but when these guys show up, it's starting to expand as Heath and more Confederates are starting to come onto the field. And I'll tell you, Eric, or Kevin, my money, this battle is one. If you want to know what Wisconsin soldiers are about, study Gettysburg.
I would agree.
Study the first day, study the second day, and this action here, what the Iron Brigade does, second, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin, plus the Michiganders and the
Indiana,
19th Indiana, 24th Mich, and the
Hoosiers.
19th Indiana. It's a credit to all three states. It really is.
Yeah. And it's looking at the timing too. Cutler's brigade pushes across Chambersburg Pike, and really is trying to straddle Chambersburg Pike, but they're pushed off within about a half an hour. They're overwhelmed. You can see just from the situation that they find themselves in. Davis's brigade here is already going to outflank the 76th New York, and then of course Archer's brigade is completely coming across to flank the 14th Brooklyn and the 95th New York, and it's in perfect position actually to just turn that flank right there and sweep across. And this is, I think, an idea, I would say, of this defeat in detail. Whether they meant to do it or not, who knows? I don't think they did. It wasn't intentional necessarily that Hill would try and defeat a division or even a couple brigades, but at that brigade level, they are well positioned to defeat an entire Union brigade and drive them off the field and put the rest of the Army of the Potomac on its heels that's coming to the field, just to try and assess it. And just at that right moment, here comes the 2nd Wisconsin, leading the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division of the 1st Corps across these fields, right in that swell between the Seminary and McPherson's Ridge we know today. And they meet with one of the staff officers and immediately, without even stopping to load, send them in. We've got to go, and then in goes the 2nd Wisconsin without even waiting for the rest of the brigade to form up. So really, these regiments are going to be sent in individually and thrown in as soon as they get to the point on the field where they can deploy into line. And as they crest that ridge in McPherson's Ridge, I'm gonna share another photograph here. It's very interesting to read some of those accounts, because if you've ever walked the battlefield, you know that the battlefield makes a big difference. What you can see, what you can experience makes a huge difference. But one thing that always points out in the battlefield is where the flags are, especially in the Civil War, because the flags really tell you where the regiment is. So if we're looking here, we see the 2nd Wisconsin's battle flag here on the left in our collection. And you see, of course, our famous Philander Wright Iron Brigade hat from the collection as well. And here in the center, I want to talk about him for a little bit. This is Philander Wright. Philander Wright is a remarkable individual in the sense of what he experienced and what he endured. Literally the night before, on June 30th, while they're in camp on Marsh Creek, he's called to the colonel's tent and is given this honor of being the flag bearer. He's not in the flag party before this. He's a member of the ranks. He's an NCO, but he actually is given this honor of being able to carry the flag from here on out and forward. And that may seem like a great honor, but it also is a great responsibility, because that flag bearer is one that really will direct the battle. If the flag goes forward, the whole regiment goes forward. If the flag goes back, the regiment will fall back. But it also means you're a perfect target. So if you're carrying that flag, which you can see has gone through a lot of damage here from battle or from air, you can see also how close of a call you can get being a flag bearer. You can see that bullet hole piercing right through the top there. And Philander actually, they crest that ridge, and every account from the 2nd Wisconsin is they take one massive volley from the Tennessee troops and the Archers Brigade that are in the woods, and a third of the entire regiment go down in that first volley alone. So you're already down to only about 200 people in the entire regiment. You start with maybe 300, give or take, and that first few minutes, you crest that ridge, and down goes a third of your party, either killed or wounded, including your lieutenant colonel. Now, Lucius Fairchild, which is a name hopefully people recognize. Can you still see my screen there?
Yep.
Perfect. We'll do this. How's that?
Good.
Lucius Fairchild, of course, is just in front of Philander Wright. He's the colonel. He's leading the regiment into the woods. And as you can see, he had a close call too. You can see there the vest that he's wearing still has the blood stains from where the bullet shattered his left elbow. You can see the blood stain still there on the handkerchief that was in his pocket at that moment. And of course, this is an after effect after they've amputated his arm. But this is within the first few minutes of this engagement as well. So the brunt of the attack takes out a good portion of the 2nd Wisconsin, but they continue the advance into the woods. And as it's only really happenstance that the rest of the brigade comes up. I'm going to bring up that map again. The rest of the brigade comes up right on their flank, right in succession, like I said, an echelon. And then the idea that, let's see if I can pull it up here. And the idea that Archer's Brigade then turns to face the 2nd Wisconsin, because remember, they're still trying to turn the flank. They're still trying to envelop this entire line that they know is straddling the Chambersburg Pike. So here comes Archer's Brigade trying to turn on the flank of the 2nd Wisconsin that's charged into the woods. And as the 1st Tennessee and the 13th Alabama are turning onto that flank of that 2nd Wisconsin, here comes the 7th. And right after that, here comes the 19th. And right after that, here comes the 24th, which has the most members of the entire brigade. And all three of those hit in succession to the point where they sweep right behind Archer's Brigade. And they actually envelop them completely to the point where now Archer's Brigade falls into complete disarray, tries to scramble back down the hillside and across Willoughby Run. And of course, as we know, Archer himself ends up being captured as the entire brigade pushes across in only about a half an hour period of time, roughly. Mm-hmm. It's not a long period of time. So that half hour that Cutler's Brigade is getting turned here in the north and being pushed back and pressed, you have the Iron Brigade succeeding in doing the exact same thing. And it's almost like this teeter-totter effect, where the northern part of the road is being pushed back and the southern part of the road is actually swinging up and pushing Archer's Brigade off the battlefield as well.
And you'll notice that time frame, if you'll scroll back up just for a second on this map, it's a 2-hour battle.
Yep.
And basically, 2 Confederate brigades are effectively rendered combat ineffective, to be precise about it. They're not completely wiped off the map.
Right.
But it happens, it's a bang-bang sort of thing. Where, you've got the Iron Brigade, the main body of the Iron Brigade doing it here, and then at the railroad cut, the 14th Brooklyn, the 95th New York, and the 6th Wisconsin, all under the command of the colonel of the 14th Brooklyn, Edward Fowler, doing the same thing to the Mississippians and the North Carolinians in the railroad cut and capturing most of them to a man, including the flag of the 2nd Mississippi. And so all of a sudden, what at 9:30 looked like a very, a serious problem for the North, and looked like things were very about to be broken open by the Confederacy. By 11:30, it's stabilized. Yep. Now, granted, there are more troops arriving on the field. The battle is far from over, but this action here, you talk about teamwork, you talk about leadership, and just the steadfastness of the soldiers involved, and it's a powerful moment for the for the Army of the Potomac on this in the war.
So let's talk about that railroad cut, because that's a point of fun discussion between someone who has a few ties to New York versus someone who has a few ties to Wisconsin. Where's my hat? I gotta wear my hat. Okay, here we go.
All right, if you insist, I'll put on my 14th Brooklyn hat here. Having written about them before, I do have to You have to mention it.
So, of course, as we saw from that map, we think of the railroad cut and the stabilization of that northern part of the Chambersburg Pike as all due to the heroic actions of the 6th Wisconsin. We can't say enough, because that's probably the best documented, essentially the best documented account of that assault. The charge across that 150 yards of field from the rail fence to that arch, or to the unfinished railroad cut, is all, of course, extremely well documented by Rufus Dawes. But is it Dawes alone? What does the 14th Brooklyn do?
Well, the 14th Brooklyn and the 95th New York are actually the reserve right now for the division. And when it becomes clear that the situation with the 2nd and the 7th Wisconsin, the rest of the Iron Brigade is being stabilized, and they see the railroad cut and they see Cutler's book guys, here's the map again, from the light blue area getting pushed back to where their dark blue is. And these Confederates are starting to push in and look like they're about to push down into the rear of the Iron Brigade, the rest of the Iron Brigade. Basically what happens is the division commander, James Wadsworth, grabs the senior ranking officer, which happens to be Edward Brush Fowler of the 14th Brooklyn, gives him the 95th New York, grabs the 6th Wisconsin, which is the other reserve regiment at that moment, and says, you guys turn, go north, and try and stop them. And Fowler issues some very quick orders. Dawes seemed to already be moving in that direction anyway, so he's already executing what orders he gets, and that's why he tries to say later, I saved the Army of the Potomac. But in reality, it's the New Yorkers and the Wisconsinites shoulder to shoulder. And they're basically, except for some of the 42nd Mississippi, most of the rest of those regiments, the 55th New York, 2nd Mississippi, and the 42nd, are captured.
Yeah.
If you go to the railroad cut today, there's a park-put a bridge that goes over it, so people kind of lose the impact of this.
Right.
But those 3 regiments were in a railroad cut where when the Federals popped up over the edge, it was a sheer drop of at least 10 feet.
Yeah.
And then there was the Confederates on the roadbed. So the Federals had them dead to rights.
Oh yeah.
And there was just nowhere for most of those Confederates to go except to throw down their weapons and surrender.
Well, and you look at the position of the 6th, since they're on the far right of that assault, they're in perfect position to cut off the railroad cut and shoot straight down the flank.
Yeah.
So they're right in the best position to capture the most, if you will, because they can completely turn that flank and go right down that nice deep ravine, while the 14th and 95th come right up to the crest. So I know we're this isn't going to be the Iron Brigade show. I promise that, even though it's turning into that. As it should be. No. But let's shift then to the discussion to the north of Gettysburg, because while all this is happening, you still also have the 11th Corps that's making its way north.
Right.
And tell us what's happening up there.
Well, the 11th Corps, you alluded to this earlier. The 11th Corps had been flanked by Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville. They're mostly German troops. They're mostly German immigrant troops from New York, Pennsylvania, and there's a regiment, the 26th Wisconsin, which is 90% German immigrant from Milwaukee and the surrounding counties. Most of these men speak German as their first language. Several of these units give their commands in German. It's very, and there's a lot of prejudice about that from a lot of the other regiments in the Army. There's a lot of anti-immigrant prejudice. And they call them, after they ran ignominiously in front of Stonewall Jackson, although not everybody did, the 11th Corps becomes known as the Flying Dutchmen, which, of course, Dutchmen, a play on Deutsch. And so here they are at Gettysburg looking to redeem that reputation. And while the 1st Corps deploys northwest of town, north of town, which you can see here, going up the York Road, which runs northeast, and then running straight up as well. I forget the name of that road. Shows up there as Newville Road.
To the Carlisle.
They will deploy, toward Carlisle, the Carlisle Pike. They will deploy up here about late morning. About that time is when, remember, Lee is concentrating his army, and there are elements that are coming down from the north. Robert Rhodes's excellent division moves down on the 11th Corps and begins to engage. And then later on in the early afternoon, Jubal Early's division will start to move down from the northeast. And if you look at the map here and you look at the dotted line, that dotted blue line, that's the extent basically of the federal position, a place called Barlow's Knoll and extending to the east. And just to the east of, or just to the west of Barlow's Knoll, excuse me, is where the 26th Wisconsin would have been. But you'll notice the Confederates come right in on them and once again flank the 11th Corps and drive them off the battlefield in rout.
Yep.
And when they are routed off the field, then so First Corps has to withdraw as well. And by about 4:30, 5 o'clock, the Federals are retreating through Gettysburg to the heights south of town.
So that I'm gonna pose this to you.
Okay.
Is it because the 11th Corps falls that the First Corps has to fall back, or is it again just a circumstance of the timing?
I actually say it's the 11th Corps.
You think
It's the collapse, and it's not even the entire 11th Corps. It's the collapse of the elements around Barlow's Knoll, which are in a bit of an exposed position anyway. And if you go stand on that hill today, you can see there's actually a lot of covered ways that Early's men used to get in there and get around it.
Yeah.
It's the collapse of that position that is the domino, that you can follow the dominoes that go right around the rest of the federal positions north and west of Gettysburg.
I would say it's a matter of timing, personally. So you think about it. Yeah, obviously, if you're looking on the map here, to the north and just to the northeast is going to be where the 11th Corps is falling back. While that's happening, there's a continuous artillery barrage hitting here the First Corps and the regiments of the Iron Brigade, just for hours, until 3 p.m. or so. After they've secured that morning engagement, they sit in that woods, the same woods that they just fought to take. They hunker down, and that's where they're holding their line. But before them, as they're laying there, they see this entire new line of Confederate troops forming on Harris Ridge, and then and even extending further south. You can see down here those other brigades that will join this renewed assault. Because again, the advantage is to the Confederates. They're concentrating troops faster than the Army of the Potomac is, because they're more prepared for it. And I genuinely do not believe that the collapse of this line in the immediate effect, or in the immediate sense, was caused by the 11th Corps. I think the 11th Corps falling back, of course, you're either going to have an entire corps that's cut off and you lose the entire First Corps, but the guys in the line here of the Iron Brigade that are laying in that woods, they have no idea what's happening behind them. They have no concept that the 11th Corps has been pushed from the field. Arguably, I would say even the 6th Wisconsin over here that's after their assault, they have no idea. They know that things aren't going well. Doubleday, who's now taken over for the what we would call the excellent human target that was John Reynolds, for some reason, who was way too close to the front line.
Yeah, you're the senior officer on the battlefield, and you're leading a brigade into action, yelling, "For God's sake, forward," and then you get shot. You have no business being there.
You command a regiment into battle or an entire wing. I don't know. Apparently, it can't be both.
Yeah.
But so I think that this line was doomed to fall anyway, simply because they just didn't have the numbers. They didn't have the position either, and they were going to keep continually being flanked. They were going to continually being pushed back. And again, I think that was part of the design. The design was just a delaying action. They weren't necessarily going to hold until the other 4 corps came up from the Army to hold this exact same ground, which pushes us next to the next phase. So the morning battle and the afternoon of the 1st has pushed everyone back through Gettysburg. The Army's in retreat and regathering now for the Army of the Potomac on the south side of the town. And set us up with that. What other things are happening through that?
Well, at this point, with the death of Reynolds, Oliver Otis Howard of the 11th Corps has taken over command of the field. And later on in the afternoon, he gets a visitor, Winfield Scott Hancock, who commands the 2nd Corps. Meade has sent him forward saying, assess the situation. Is this the place where we should put the army? And Howard and Hancock actually do a great job of rallying the troops on the heights south of Gettysburg. And Hancock sends back and says, this is where we need to be. And so Meade orders the Army to concentrate on Gettysburg. And so throughout that night, you're going to start to see more Federal troops arrive. Same is true of the Confederates, by the way, because Lee is going to order his Army to concentrate at Gettysburg. And so you start to get more troops that will start to show up on both sides. And so this battle, which started, with a small skirmish on the morning of July 1st, is attracting both sides, the main body of both sides. The Federals, of course, form a very famous, the fishhook line, if you will, along the chain of hills south and west of Gettysburg, or southeast of Gettysburg, excuse me, I'm getting my directions mixed up. And the 1st and 11th Corps will actually hold what I consider to be the absolute key ground of the battlefield, which is Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. And hopefully you're trying to find a map here so that I can show where they are.
That wasn't the one I wanted to bring up, but it'll work.
Okay.
Hold on. Keep going.
Well, if you imagine a fish hook, for those of you who are listening while he finds a map for us, if you imagine a fish hook, and you imagine basically put the long end to the south and then run it up, and then it curves around, and then there's the little barb on the end, that's Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, is that curve and that barb right there. And the reason why it's so critical is because the Baltimore Pike, which runs directly behind that and then runs southeast towards Baltimore, is the supply line for the Army of the Potomac. It's the lifeline. You could lose every other hill on that fishhook position. And there we go. There we go. The fishhook is where you see Culp's Hill, and then bring your cursor around Cemetery Hill, down Cemetery Ridge to the Round Tops. That's the fishhook that I'm talking about. And Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill are the key, and you can see the Baltimore Pike right there. You could conceivably lose or at least give up lodgements on the other ridges, but as long as you hold the Baltimore Pike, the Army of the Potomac will be able to get away. But if you lose the Culp's Hill or potentially Cemetery Hill, you lose the Baltimore Pike, and you could win everywhere else, and the Army of the Potomac will have to retreat from Gettysburg.
Yeah. And
on the night of July 2nd, because I want to leave some time for questions, if you'll indulge me, Kevin, I'll go a little bit deep here.
That's fine.
The 12th Army Corps had been over there for most of the day. There are about 12,000 guys, and they had been ordered because the Confederates had been launching attacks over on the other end of the line, as you can see here on the afternoon of July 2nd. They had been ordered to move across the rear of the Army to the area where you see the word Ridge on Cemetery Ridge. They had left one brigade of about 3,500 New Yorkers, all New York outfit, under the command of a guy named George Green, who was a well-trained engineer and had dug in on Culp's Hill. Late in the afternoon, Allegheny Johnson, you see the red there, the Stonewall Division, Stonewall Jackson's old division of about 8,000 men, attack. And as they're coming up into the hills, or coming up Culp's Hill and into the vacant trenchments, as dusk is starting to fall, Greene realizes he's got problems. And here's a more detailed map for you. And he calls for reinforcements. Now, many people have probably seen the movie Gettysburg, or you've read about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain over on Little Round Top, where he swings part of the 20th Maine back and then attacks. We have a larger, more critical version of it here. Because what happens is you'll see the Confederates are swinging in, and you'll notice that arrow is pointing into the rear of the 137th New York under the command of a guy named David Ireland.
Right here.
Why nobody has ever heard of him? Because he dies of dysentery the following year, and he never got to write his memoirs like Chamberlain did. And so as the line is starting to bend back, Ireland has to bend the line back 90 degrees, and Greene calls for reinforcements. And who gets sent over there? The 6th Wisconsin and the 14th Brooklyn. And in the evening, as you can see, the 10th Virginia, 23rd Virginia, 37th Virginia start to sweep north and try and push back and try and close and drive off the 137th New York, which we're on the verge of doing. As those Confederates are coming up, all of a sudden they're greeted with 2 fresh lines of infantry pouring death into them. And that's the Brooklyn Boys and the 6th Wisconsin. And that night, the Confederates fall back, decide to regroup and renew the battle in the morning. And that saves the Baltimore Pike.
Yep.
That saves the Army of the Potomac.
Yep.
I give a tour. Whenever I do battlefield tours of Gettysburg, I talk about the 5 crisis points of the Army of the Potomac that day. 2 of them on Little Round Top, another one in the wheat field and peach orchard, another one on Cemetery Ridge. But I always make the point, none of those first 4 matter if this isn't a Union victory. And the Union ends up surviving all four of those great crises. And it's all academic if it's not for this.
Yep. And I think that's a great example of how there was Wisconsin involvement all 3 days. We've got the instrumental involvement of the 26th Wisconsin trying their best with the 11th Corps to hold the ground. You've got the Iron Brigade, of course, along with the 1st Corps holding the ground on to the north and west as long as they can. And then, of course, on the 2nd, completely determining the survival of the Army on Culp's Hill. So let's move to the 3rd here briefly. We've only got a couple more minutes. We'll stop here in about 4 minutes. And we'll touch on one last component of Wisconsin's involvement in the Battle of Gettysburg, and that happens to be in the form of an individual. Happens to be an aide at the time. He's an aide de camp to a general who happens to witness the pivotal moment of the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3rd. We all know as Pickett's charge. So tell us about Frank Haskell here.
Frank Haskell is a lieutenant. I think he's the adjutant general to Winfield Scott Hancock, who we've already met as the commander of the 2nd Corps. Had fought all through the day on the 2nd. The Confederates had assailed both flanks. And then in the afternoon of July 3rd, Lee decided to send 15,000 men across the open field between Seminary Ridge, where the Confederates are, and Cemetery Ridge, which is where the 2nd Corps is, in an effort to drive through the Union center and hopefully win the battle. And it's going to include 3 different divisions. Of course, George Pickett's division being one, all Virginia division, therefore Pickett's charge. But there, as a lot of North Carolinians will tell you, there were more Tar Heels that were involved than anything else, but that's a whole other talk for a whole other time.
It is indeed.
Frank Haskell's story is very interesting because the Confederates do manage to get into the works and do manage to get atop the ridge and over the famous stone wall that's right there. And the reserves are ordered in. Hancock has just been wounded. He's been up front so his men can see him. He's been wounded by shrapnel and gunfire. And as he's going down, he's already issued orders, though, for the reserves to come forward. And as the reserves, which I believe are the Philadelphia Brigade were the ones that were attacked, it was other elements of John Gibbon's division that were coming forward. A couple of regiments were not going in the direction that they needed to go. And Frank Haskell, and there's a lesson in this for staff leadership and staff initiative. Frank Haskell realized what was happening. He knew what Hancock intended. And he knew that if they continued to move in the direction they were going, they would leave a gap in the perimeter that they're trying to contain the Confederates. Mm-hmm. And so on his own initiative, he goes over and says, I'm a staff officer. I'm carrying orders from General Hancock. I want you to basically turn 45 degrees and attack with the bayonet. And there are contemporary accounts that say that turned the battle and saved that part of the Union line. Yep. And of course, shortly thereafter, Pickett's men and the rest of the Confederates are sent scurrying back from whence they came, with the Union taunting them all the way. Right.
So I think that's a great way to show that, like I said, that Wisconsin involvement. Wisconsin was there, not just on day one, even though I have a bias, but on all parts of the day or all parts of the battle. And not just as a regiment or as a unit, but as individuals, because in the end, that's what we're about. We talk about that humanity behind the history, and I wanted to set that stage. We talked a lot at the beginning about what weather they're going through, which happens to be very similar to the thunderstorm that is rolling through my house right at the moment. But this mentality of what they were enduring, what they went through, and Haskell is probably writes the best account of that assault that is so famously known. Mm-hmm. And just reading through his letters, I mean, his letters home are 10, 12 pages long, because he knows what he's witnessing, and he's leaving that record for not only his family to know what he endured and what he looked at, but also he's leaving that for history. Because what better way to understand history than in their own words? And that's what we do at the Veterans Museum. We try and capture who they are, what they felt, good and bad. We try and determine, not necessarily determine what is right and what is wrong, but give you the facts and give you the stories the way they are, because they're human, they're people. And that's the whole point. You can you can really hopefully get some of that with seeing the artifacts, seeing the blood-stained vest of Fairchild, or looking at those tattered flags from the Iron Brigade. But what better way to understand than in their own words? With that, I do want to leave us about 5 minutes for Q&A, if there are any.
I'm sure there is.
There are a couple questions here, Kevin. The first one comes from Mike S. Goodman, and he wants to know how much an obstacle was the South Mountain.
Oh, as in like 1862 Battle of South Mountain?
He just refers to the South Mountain as an obstacle, and it says even today the area is quite rugged and thinly settled. And he's just curious about how much of an obstacle that presented.
I would say in 1862, it was a great obstacle because the armies were moving perpendicular to the way the mountain runs. In 1863, it's very little of an obstacle for the simple fact that the armies are moving parallel to it. The only way it is an obstacle in a campaign is actually during the retreat, when the Confederates pulled back to Chambersburg and then south, and the Federals come through. So it kind of channelizes the advance.
Right.
But yeah, in 1863, South Mountain is kind of looming there to the west for the Federals and for much of the Battle of Gettysburg.
Excellent. The second question comes from Michael Olson. And he says, today, I think most people view Gettysburg as the most famous and probably by extension, the most important battle of the Civil War. But to put it in perspective, how did the people view Gettysburg at the time?
If you actually, the best way to put Gettysburg into perspective is look at what happens the day after Pickett's charge and the fall of Vicksburg in the West. It's another victory in the West. And actually, those in the hospitals in Gettysburg for the several days afterwards talk about the fanfare. There's a guy from the 7th Wisconsin who is he's amazed by how many flags and celebrations there are at the surrender of this town in Mississippi, because it secures really the Mississippi River in that section. And I think at the time, there was more fanfare of what was happening in the West. This was essentially the turning point in the East. But Chris, what do you think? I know obviously we all remember it today, and of course the National Park and the cemetery play a big role in that in November of '63.
The Army of the Potomac knew what it had done, and for the Army itself, it was a turning point for sure. But there was also an effort to try and pursue Lee. It was only one stage in a campaign. It wasn't a definitive. It's only through hindsight. And oh, by the way, the fact that President Lincoln shows up to dedicate the Gettysburg Cemetery, that really burns Gettysburg into the ethos of the United States. Much in the same way, for example, when Ronald Reagan went to Normandy and gave that talk at Pointe du Hoc, really burned Pointe du Hoc and Omaha Beach into the American psyche. And so I think you need that presidential assistance. One of my friends, Matt Atkinson, gives a talk, and he talks about what if Lincoln had gone to Vicksburg instead to dedicate the National Cemetery out there? What would that have done? So that's something to think about.
Excellent, gentlemen. The next question comes from a participant owner. And he wants to know what became of Meade's plan to draw the Confederates down to Pipe Creek.
I'm tapping out, Chris.
Okay. Meade did have, for those of you who may not be familiar, Meade had his engineers a couple days before along the Pipe Creek area just south of the Pennsylvania-Maryland border as another range of hills to defend on. And he had circulated that, the famous Pipe Creek Circular. To be honest, I've heard some thoughts, and I think it's plausible. Hancock's Corps being around Pipe Creek, Meade turned to him and said, you know what's here. Go to Gettysburg. If it's better, tell me. And it was better.
Yeah.
Pipe Creek was always a contingency in the back of Meade's head. You know, the famous Council of War the night of July 2nd, where he meets with everybody. And one of the questions is, do we withdraw? Do we stay? What do we do?
Right.
And everybody says, this is good ground, we should stay. But the fact that the question is even posed says that Meade has it always in the back of his head that if I got to abandon where I am at Gettysburg, I've got a fallback position at Pipe Creek, and everybody already knows what might need to happen. And in the event, it was never needed.
And remember that the troops, the army is still concentrating even as of the night of the 2nd. They're still not all on the field. He does not have his entire army to play with and maneuver. So it is a definite decision that he makes to keep an advanced position where most of the corps are now starting to converge, or do you fall back a little bit to where you could actually have all the corps come up faster and sooner? So it speaks to the quality of the ground and that the tactical decision by Hancock, that it was worth making those corps come up further than when they would have been able to be deployed before.
Well, gentlemen, we are exactly right out of time, and all the questions have been answered that we've gone through on the chat boards. Once again, I'd like to thank Chris and Kevin for their tremendous expertise and passion as well on the subject. Both of those came through spectacularly. And then also thank you to Jennifer Carlson from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation, again, for supporting these free programs. And of course, everybody who participated and attended the panel discussion today. We look forward to seeing everybody come back in a couple weeks for our next one. Please look at our website for details on that and registration links. Gentlemen, thank you. Jennifer, thank you. Everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. Please try to stay dry from the looks out there. We might have problems doing that. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you much. Putting this back on. I know the shadow doesn't work, but I'm doing it.
All right. I don't know if anybody can read 14th Brooklyn, but why not?
I think that would be an excellent book someday, Chris, if we did a story of the relationship between the 14th Brooklyn and the 6th Wisconsin, because those famous moments that they share together. It's not just at Gettysburg. It's the first 3 years of the war, really, the first two, or for 2 years at least, because they have the exact same experience that they do in 1862 at the Battle of Antietam, fighting shoulder to shoulder.
Bronner Farm.
Yep.
Hatch's Brigade at Bronner Farm. Cornfield at Antietam. They're right next to each other at Fredericksburg.
Right.
You know, the same experience they were right next to each other at Chancellorsville.
Yep. I will say that one of the best stories of Chancellorsville, you guys can stay on if you want. We're just chatting now. Best stories of Chancellorsville is Rufus Dawes, 6th Wisconsin, and we bring it up because he's the 14th. He distinctly remembers that Colonel Bragg, because he's lieutenant colonel at the time, Colonel Bragg sleeps with his spurs on because they shared a tent. And that night, the night of the Battle of Chancellorsville, apparently Bragg not only sleeps with his spurs on, but he also has what I would assume is restless leg syndrome. So he kept kicking Dawes with his spurs in the middle of the night.
Oh, wow.
And that was
I had not heard that before.
Years later, because he could remember being kicked the entire night by spurs.
I'm glad you call it the 14th Brooklyn, because there was they were known as the 14th New York State Militia.
Yeah.
And they went into battle at Manassas. And Irvin McDowell, after the battle, which, by the way, they were not that far from the 2nd Wisconsin on Henry Hill. And after the battle, the state wants to rename them the 84th New York.
Yep.
And they appeal to Irvin McDowell, and McDowell says, "You have been baptized by fire under the number 14."
Yep.
And they get a surgeon later who's assigned to the regiment, and he shows up and he's already pre-printed, all proud on his back, 84th New York on his kit. And he shows up and he goes into the report to the colonel and leaves his kit outside on the tent. And when he comes back out, it's like a 5-10 minute interview talking to the colonel and stuff. 84th New York's been taken off his knapsack.
I do think there's a great chance for some future talks about the relationship between Wisconsin and the 14th Brooklyn. I think there's a lot of comparisons. There's a lot of camaraderie between them too.
Yeah, there is.
Never mind.
The respect between quality units. They respect what each other's done. They both have been in it. And let's be honest too, a lot of the Iron Brigade units are based on militia.
Yep.
And so I think there's a camaraderie there. It's a, hey, we were in state service, or many of us were in state service before Fort Sumter, and we're going to be in state service after we go home.
And there's a whole other discussion to have about who picked up the 6th Wisconsin's flag in the cornfield of Antietam. Was it the 14th Brooklyn because the 6th left it behind, or was it some other reason? But that can be a different discussion.
Yeah, we'll leave that one. We'll leave that one alone. So, very cool. Well, we seem to have a few hangers on. I thank everybody who did.
Yes. No other questions?
None have filtered through so far, gentlemen.
So, Chris, who stopped a bullet better, Reynolds or Hancock?
Depends on how you define better.
I would say Hancock's was actually worth it. Reynolds was not. Hancock was on the site when he needed to be as a symbol at the moment that it was required. Reynolds did not need to be leading the 2nd Wisconsin, and Fairchild was doing that just fine on his own. He didn't even have the rest of the regiments up yet. There was no reason for Reynolds to be that close.
Reynolds had no business being where he was. Hancock was doing his job and was exactly where he needed to be.
Yep.
Question, did Lee burn Chambersburg? No. The burning of Chambersburg was the 30th of July, 1864.
Yep.
So that was a year later, and that was a cavalry raid as a kind of in the interlude between the raid on Washington by Jubal Early and then the Valley Campaign, August, September, October, 1864. Yep. Interestingly enough, by the way, my alma mater, Emory and Henry College, the colonel of the 22nd Virginia Cavalry, which received the order to burn Chambersburg in 1864, was a professor from Emory and Henry.
Oh, wow.
He refused to do it.
Oh, wow.
And John McCausland placed him under arrest and burned the city. And then took him out of arrest once they were riding south. But yeah, that's always been a thing at Emory and Henry, is the professor of philosophy, if I remember correctly, named Peters, who refused to burn the city of Chambersburg. So, but that was 1864. That was a year later.
That's a great. There's another great question here. The one soldier talking about getting milk and butter. What was the normal diet for a soldier? It's actually imagine, if you will, eating really salty bacon and saltines for 3 meals a day, every day of the year for 3 years or the duration of the war, whichever comes first. Because that's what they ate. They were given salt pork, or a meat ration, if you will, and a bread ration, which usually turned out to be a hard pack. Sometimes, especially during winter, they were fresh bread, but very rarely. Really, it was mostly just a giant saltine cracker, if you will. But it's extremely hard. It's about a ½ an inch thick, 3/4 of an inch thick, and very durable. It lasts really long time, but it does not taste like a whole lot. So what you do is you fry up your bacon, and you use the grease of your bacon, and you put your hardtack in that grease, and it gives it a little flavor. And there's where you go. But the best ration that they received, that every soldier talked about, was coffee. Coffee was essentially the thing that they loved the best. In fact, every time they stopped marching, they would ask specifically, is there enough time to make a cup of coffee, to make a pot of coffee? Because it takes a while. You have to start a fire. You have to boil the water, and things like that. I want to do that one of these days, Eric. I want to do like a let's cook at home with how you do it in the field kind of thing. But in fact, on June 28th, so yesterday, 157 years ago, Wadsworth, the division commander that commanded the Iron Brigade, that had the Iron Brigade in the division, he actually orders his men to halt for the day. The soldiers specifically ask, do we have time to make coffee? They did, except there were rules in the Army that you could not destroy private property. And there was a nice rail fence just next to the road. And the soldiers were very much concerned that they weren't going to be able to make a fire to boil their coffee. So Wadsworth pays the farmer $250 of his own money so that he can buy the rails from the fence so that they can start a fire to make their coffee.
That's taking care of your people.
It is.
Kevin, I like your suggestion of recreating that. We'll set up a little encampment in your backyard, and
was
Spent
good.
a couple days out there cooking up our salt pork and our coffee. You'll have to make the hardtack. I tried it once. It didn't turn out too well. Probably about as good as the one we have in the display case downstairs.
Probably tastes the same.